Hello, and welcome to the 25th Williams Research Center Symposium, Recovered Voices, Black Activism in New Orleans from Reconstruction to the Present Day. I'm Jessica Dorman, Director of Publications here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. This year's program is a little different from the symposia we've run in the past, not only because it's taking place in virtual space, but because it's focused on books. And this weekend, you'll have a chance to meet the talented authors whose archival research has resurrected the voices of 19th century Black activists. Afro-Creole poetry in French, Economy Hall, and Monumental are remarkable works of scholarship, true labors of love. But they're not the only books that we've published here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. We have titles as varied as Furnishing Louisiana, a landmark in decorative arts scholarship, to Ernie Cato, Emperor of New Orleans, to a new biography of sculptor Enrique Alferez out this spring. We hope that you will visit the shop at the collection or your favorite local independent bookseller. Read these books, enjoy them, and then reach out. You can visit hnoc.org/books for our submission guidelines. We're always looking for new book manuscripts. Who knows, maybe the next recovered voice will be yours. Thanks so much and enjoy the symposium.
Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing today? My name is Elizabeth and I'm in programming here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. We had a terrific launch yesterday evening where Kate Masser provided us with an introductory framework of Reconstruction civil rights activism, but on the national level. So that today allows us to now continue our program this morning with a more focused approach on activism within the New Orleans sphere. Before I hand over the spotlight though, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping notes for you today. Our session will last approximately 1 hour. We'll hear from our speakers this morning, and then we'll follow with a Q&A session. You can submit your questions from the audience at any time throughout the program by using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. We do have Spanish interpretation available. Click the globe at the bottom of your screen to get started setting that up. And last thing, we have a brief one-question survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the session when you exit out. We would really appreciate it if you could just take a second to answer that question. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you my colleague, Margaret Longbrake. Margaret, good morning.
Good morning, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. As Elizabeth said, thank you so very, very much for taking your Saturday morning out to come and participate with us. I'm senior editor here at the Historic New Orleans Collection, and it has been about 11 years, almost to the day, really to the month, since I attended a comparative literature conference here in New Orleans and heard Clint Bruce read these beautiful translations of poems from Civil War era New Orleans, and every word out of his mouth was something that I hadn't known before. I didn't even live in New Orleans at the time. I had no idea that there were Afro-Creole newspapers run by free people of color in the Civil War era, as the Civil War was beginning. This Francophone community.
Está empezada esta comunidad francófona que hablaba francés, todo lo que se ha dicho y todo lo que se ha hecho de forma.
I was very excited to talk to him afterward. And 10 years later, we do have this. Afro-Creole in poetry in French from Louisiana's radical Civil War era newspapers. Now, you won't necessarily hear about every scholarly book what I'm about to say, which was that this was a wild ride. It has discoveries, it has mistaken identities, it has long lost newspapers after the Mechanics Institute massacre that Clint discovered in Boston. It has a hoax, it has a dramatic twist at the end. I cannot say enough about what a joy this has been to work on with him over the last 10 years. We call this session Hidden in Plain Sight because one of the things Clint discovered about these poems is that the poets were writing back and forth to each other in poems in the newspapers, sometimes subtly, but sometimes actually addressing the poems back and forth to each other, which was wonderful thing to discover and to find a way to actually highlight those conversations in this book. But there are other ways in which these conversations are hidden, not the least of which is the fact that they are in French. And this is a largely Anglophone world that we live in now. And part of what has been so exciting is to reincorporate the very rich, long, and still very present Francophone tradition here in Louisiana. I'm going to turn the conversation now over to Clint and Angel Adams Parham, who we were lucky enough to get involved in the project. She writes a wonderful foreword to the book that gives it additional context. So let's see. Clint Bruce is assistant professor at Université Sainte-Anne in Nova Scotia, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Acadian and Transnational Studies. His research focuses on the Acadian diaspora and the transnational Acadia, on Francophone identities in Louisiana, and on the Francophone Atlantic world. He holds a doctorate in Francophone Studies from Brown University, a master's degree from City University of New York, and 2 bachelor's degrees from Centenary College of Louisiana. His work has appeared in 19th century French studies, Francophonie d'Amérique, Minorité linguistique et société, Histoire engagée, Transatlantica, and Romance Studies, among other publications. And his previous translations include works by T. Mayhart Dardar, Karen Cassé-Bell, and Jean Arsenault. Angel Adams Parham is the Reverend Joseph Victor Distinguished Professor of Social Science and Associate Professor of Sociology at Loyola University, New Orleans. Much of her work is in the area of comparative and historical sociology of race. She is the author of American Roots, Racial Palimpsests and the Transformation of Race, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And it examines the change in race and racializations in New Orleans under the French, Spanish, and Anglo-American administrations. The book was co-winner of the Social Science History Association's Alan Sharlin Memorial Book Award in 2018.
Sí, en el 2010.
Sociological Association's Barrington Moore Book Award in Comparative and Historical Sociology. Angel and Clint are going to talk for about half an hour, and then we'll have a
Por
Q&A.
media hora y después vamos a tener una sesión de preguntas y respuestas.
I hope that you will bring to the session of Meet the Author on Sunday at 4, in which we'll invite people to drop in and talk a little more one-on-one casually. Clint, Angel, thank you so much for being here, and please.
Thank you so much, Margit, for that wonderful introduction to the volume and of us and our work. It is such a pleasure, Clint, to be here with you. I can't say enough about how much I love this book. It's really just wonderful. And as Margaret said, one of the first things I wanted to open our conversation up with is that she had no idea that this existed, right? And then as soon as she learned about it, she thought, naturally, this has to be a book. And so I wrote a bit about this in my foreword, that there's a real need to recover this Francophone culture as a central part of American culture as well. There's so much that's unknown. And, I could go on and on about this, just different aspects of our history that really what's happened here amongst French speakers, Afro-Creoles, has been significant for so much of the country, and yet can't seem to really get into this larger American narrative. Why do you think this?
This is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, and I think it's probably the case for you as well, Angel. What was striking a minute ago when Margaret was describing our first meeting in New Orleans is that when you visit New Orleans, you see names. I mean, you're surrounded by all this history, right? It's not like New Orleans is this unknown location, but this crucial aspect of American history is largely hidden in plain sight. So there'll be a little Q&A with me tomorrow. I can go more into my biographical aspects, but I really came at this from the French-speaking angle, from a student. I quickly discovered, as I enjoyed French, that French was not a foreign language, that there was a living community of French speakers in Louisiana, and that community had a rich cultural heritage. And as someone who grew up in North Louisiana in an English-speaking environment, this was a major discovery for me, right? As it may have been for you when you moved to Louisiana. So, why is this hidden? I mean, I think that part of the reason is linguistic. The United States views itself as an English-speaking nation. It is not an English-speaking country, right? We have one of the largest Spanish-speaking populations of any country. I mean, we're a Latin American country in many ways. The 19th century, as you know, was very multilingual. There were German language schools, there were Swedish language newspapers, early 20th century Yiddish theater. This is, part of it is our monolingual ideology. I don't know if you have any particular thoughts that, Angel, you want to sort of riff off on those, but part of it is simply the way we tell our national story. There's not a lot of space for other language communities unless they're assimilating. I mean, we have room for that, right? When they start learning English, we have that fits.
Yeah, now I think that the linguistic aspect of it is a challenge for so many of us, and it's been a rather low priority to work toward everyone speaking more than one language, which I think is very much needed in the United States in order to function well in a society. I think, even though English is the lingua franca, it's very important to us to be able to, even if we're only thinking in terms of being globally competitive, to be able to communicate with other people. But there are all sorts of other reasons, that it's good to be able to function in different languages. But, truthfully, before I moved here, this was not really something I thought about, right? And so I'm a product of the same kinds of educational system that just doesn't really take, any kind of notice of this. But one of the reasons I think this is so important, and I talk about this some in my book, is I do a comparison of 3 versions of the Plessy case. And this is one of my favorite comparisons. And I compare a version from our documents, which is a us.gov website, a PBS version of the Plessy case, and the Schomburg version of the Plessy case. And so these are all on websites, easy for, the everyday person to view, just kind of a short, like paragraph long. And what I saw is at the us.gov site, you would never know that anyone involved there was French speaking. That,
Amazing.
The idea of Creole, of French, the fact that it was the Comité des Citoyens who were organizing the case, nothing. You go to PBS, you do get reference to Creoles, right? That Homer Plessy was coming from this Afro-Creole community. It gives you a little bit of a summary of what who Creoles were, so that's helpful. Then when you get to the Schomburg account, which I believe was, there was a lot of input from Karen Casse-Bell, if I'm remembering correctly there, so I'm not surprised, it's the fullest account. And it talks about Afro-Creoles, it talks about many of them, their roots in Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, and it's a very full account. So the concern for me is that Plessy case is central to so much. It set the tone for Jim Crow across the South and impacted the entire country. So can we do justice to the complexity of who was involved there? And I find it, particularly concerning that even when I'm teaching this here in New Orleans, where it happened, that is not commonplace knowledge that this happened around the corner in Treme amongst many Afro-Creoles. And so that's where I think, hidden in plain sight, we need to do a better job of this.
And if I can, before we discuss the poetry itself, if I could add, I very much enjoyed Kate Masters' opening lecture last night. Very much. I'm saying that because I'm now going to say something that's it's not a critique. It's simply how framing can erase certain realities or simply not make room for them. Taking a national U.S. view automatically sort of sets up a frame that potentially doesn't allow for the Creole story. That was an excellent lecture that really brought out a lot of the convergences during Reconstruction, quite masterful. But the Creoles sort of start to look like the folks in South Carolina and in other places. And in some ways, they were facing the same realities, but coming from a very different standpoint in so many other ways. Not only linguistically, but also ideologically and culturally. And I don't mean their culture is in their ethnic background. I mean their culture in the French sense of their cultural references, right? Their intellectual traditions. And maybe that could allow us to shift into a second topic, Angel, which is the role of poetry in our public square and in our public sphere. I think many of us, no matter for whomever one voted, would have been quite struck at the recent presidential inauguration by the voice, the figure, and certainly the words of Amanda Gorman, who was in many ways carrying a tradition of critique in her poem, The Hill We Climb, a critiquing and also imagining a better future. And that's what's going on in these poems that were published in the 1860s in these two newspapers, L'Union and La Tribune, also critiquing and imagining a better future. I was wondering, so for you, someone who's studied and continues to study very deeply and on the ground, so you mentioned your classroom, issues of identity and politics, what do you see as a sociologist of race, ethnicity, cultural groups? What do you see when you read these poems as far as their contribution goes?
Yes, good question. I mean, what I see is, like you said, a tradition, a tradition of speaking powerfully, prophetically, prophetically in many ways, prophetically in the sense, so sometimes people think prophetic, okay, that means I'm telling the future. Not necessarily. Prophetically in the sense of critique, right? So in the traditional sense, going back to kind of a biblical context of prophetic, it was the prophet is coming to tell you, if you don't get things right, this is what's going to happen, right? And so the prophet is coming to tell you, you need to shape up. Something's not wrong. Something's not right here. The prophet is coming to tell you, this is what you're doing. You are oppressing my people, right? You are oppressing those who are outsiders. You are oppressing those who are hurting. You are oppressing the hungry. And God is not pleased. And if you want to have favor, you need to change, all right? And so when I talk about a kind of prophetic...
Hablo de traiciones proféticas, a eso es lo que yo me refiero. Inclusive cuando alguien viene de una...
of critique, of looking out at society and saying, this is something, that needs to be addressed. And the power of poetry is that it gives you this entree to understanding reality. It lifts you up in a way that prose and, kind of flat nonfiction accounts often can't do. You are drawn into images and reality. And then also, if you have the joy of hearing the poet speak, the cadence just brings you in and helps you see in a way that you often can't see in other genres.
That's really well put, and it meets up, it converges with a lot of my reactions as I read the poems and rediscovered them. I've been reading these poems, some of them for a very long time, some of them for a few years, and thinking about that prophetic role, what these Creoles, these Francophone New Orleanians, Louisianans were doing during Reconstruction really gets at the heart of what poetry is in its etymological sense, which means to make something, right? So whenever I think about poetics in relation to politics, you can't have one without the other, right? So any sort of transformation, any way of collective life has an aesthetic aspect to it. And in this particular moment, really more largely a poetics of transformation for me involves how a group and how a writer imagines the world, imagines himself in the world, and also reimagines the world, right? What do I want this world to look like? And in the 1860s, there are seismic shifts in the country, in the world, and certainly in local communities and in people's lives. And we're going to have some examples of poems in a couple of minutes. But some of these poems are quite personal. And as feminists told us and reminded us in the 70s, the personal is political, and it certainly is in this collection of poems. So you brought up the issue of voice. If you agree, I think it would be a great time to hear some poets' voices.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I want to describe this project that I certainly have no hand in other than providing translations for some of the poems that will be featured. The Historic New Orleans collection has undertaken to elicit from 3 contemporary New Orleans poets their responses to poems from Afro-Creole poetry, from the 2 newspapers, L'Union and La Tribune. We now have access to one of them that's been filmed, and we're going to share that. So there is a vocalist and voice actor, Ivan Griffin, who has a beautiful bass baritone voice. He's an opera singer, who will read a selection from an 1864 poem entitled Le Triomphe des Opprimés, the Triumph of the Oppressed. And to that text has responded Kelly Harris DeBerry with a poem called We Are the Holy Ones. So Margit, if you want to cue up that video, we'll step back and let our audience enjoy some of these modern interventions.
In Civil War era New Orleans, Afro-Creole newspapers run by free people of color published conversations hidden in French language poems. Poets wrote back and forth to each other about civil rights, current events, friendship, and love. In 2020, the Historic New Orleans collection published Afro-Creole poetry in French to bring these conversations back to life in the original French and in English translations by Clint Bruce. New Orleans poets were invited to choose one of these 19th century poems and write their own 21st century responses. 8 novembre 1864. Le triomphe des opprimés. Pourquoi vouloir troubler notre terre bénie? Pourquoi tant d'intérêt à la race avilie du nègre qui, pour nous, fertilise nos champs? Fields? To us, to our children belong his labor's yields. As long as an animal receives its feed, has not the law of nature been satisfied? Such are their wicked appeals. But a more humane voice by the oppressors is heard, crippling both the whip and the chain with this word. These Black Africans whom you have cursed, these slaves subdued and condemned by you to the worst, are they not also God's wondrous works of art, and men, your equals, endowed with noble heart? Brothers were ye at first, and when they finally heard that sacred voice, the sons of the downtrodden race did make the choice to answer the call as cheerful volunteers to vanquish their oppressors or die as soldiers, having paid the price of blood, of bitter tears over the cherished remembrance of husbands and brothers. Indeed, you'll have won the right to equity and your proper rank among humanity. Neither chain nor auction, shattered by your swords, shall ever return to attempt to crush your innards, ye sons of liberty.
We are the holy ones, baptized in a sea of last breaths and bones. The ocean is a lover, but men strike like thunder, casting nets over the living. They come wicked, traveling like snakes. We know the venom, the sound of hiss chasing our flesh, our backs bent like rainbows over indigo, chopping sugarcane, chained to evil imaginations. But we are the holy ones, tending to earth's brutal harvest. We are the stripes of blood of glorious flags, paraded for slaughter in old fields and new plantations. Don't you hear the weeping, pulling back history's skin? We have no remedy in this land. What is the color of free? What is the color of human? We are the holy ones, weeping at the altar of our dead, turning over children like soil. How far must our moans float down river? When will death bring good news and eat the master soil? We want the afterlife and all the seats of heaven. We are the holy ones. Flowers returned as fire, the impossible gold conjured back from our ancient home and bodies. We are the holy ones, sweet darkness gathering, a lightning rod over evil's head. Don't you smell the ash of freedom rising? Don't you smell the ashes of freedom rising? Don't you smell freedom rising, rising, rising? Rising, rising, rising.
Wow. I feel like I have been ushered into a holy place.
Me
Listening.
siento como que he sido empujada a un lugar sagrado escuchando eso.
Me
To
siento
hear himself talk, there are a few things that leave me relatively speechless, but not only how finely crafted that text is, but Kelly Harris DeBerry is a really powerful reader. So maybe one day we'll see her at a presidential inauguration if if she so chose to accept that invitation. I really can't wait to see and hear the other contributions, and I imagine everyone who watched also feels that.
Yeah, and I think what you get there is just this powerful distillation of historical forces, suffering, but also overcoming, that you just can't get in almost any other genre I can think of. And it's so precious. And I have long been convinced we need more poetry in our lives as a culture, as a country. And this can also help to transition us into talking about some of the specific poems in the volume. But one of the things I wanted to say as we transition to that is, what I find particularly powerful is the fact that there was poetry in the newspapers, right? So I think about, picking up the New York Times or the Washington Post, not much poetry in there. Maybe the New Yorker, but this is what I think. I feel like this is a kind of a symptom of something. What it's a symptom of exactly, I'm not sure, but poetry, by missing poetry, we are missing something essential. Something essential. And I say that as an apologist of poetry. I'm not a poet, but I would say I'm an apologist for the importance of poetry. To the extent that every year I usually have a party where people are hired to bring them and to share it. I look forward to April for National Poetry Month. And I can't really understand why almost no one else is interested. So
Nadie más está interesado.
this volume and the fact that it came
Creo que
from newspapers, that was part of the public discourse, is such an important part of this.
You know, that reminds me, growing up in Shreveport, I read the Shreveport Times, even as a middle school student, and I would read letters to the editor. And I ended up writing a couple later on as a college student, but there was a little note, please do not send poetry. And, and I thought, well, that's interesting. They must be getting, inundated with submissions. Of course, as I began to do historical research, I realized that poetry was prominently featured in daily and weekly newspapers and in the press in earlier periods, and that it was viewed as a valid contribution to
Miraba como una contribución muy válida a este curso.
recognition of that through the roles of poets laureates. But of course, I agree. I agree with you fully. We're not making enough space for that. And that's one reason that it inspired me to want to carry this book project through, for sure. The sense certainly came out of the video we just watched, and I think it will from the excerpts that we're about to share and comment. But I fundamentally believe that these poems written by folks like Adolphe Duhart, Joanie Kesti, Henri Louis Rey in the 1860s have not finished their work. They were making points that we still need to take to heart today. And we can see if readers agree or if they're relics of a bygone era. I think not, but that's the bet that I've placed. So Angel, is there we have a few poems we've selected. I don't know if you want to choose a first one that you feel particularly appropriate to pull up on the screen, do a little reading and a little commenting, but I certainly feel ready.
Sure. I think I'd like to start with Poésie Vox Dei, because I think that's a good transition for talking about the prophetic role of poets.
Well, I'm going to pull it up, and if you like, I can read the French, and then you can read the English below it, and then we'll see where that takes us in our thinking. So the poem is titled Poésie Vox Dei, or Poetry Vox Dei in my translation, by Adolphe Duhart, published in 1866. Here is one stanza from this longer text. Quel tumulte joyeux vient frapper notre oreille. C'est un peuple avili qui maintenant s'éveille. Ô poète, reprends ton luth. Les carcans sont brisés, plus de honteux servage. De notre sol enfin disparaît l'esclavage. Liberté, liberté. Salut.
What joyous uproar is it that strikes our ears? A people disgraced awakens from its fears. O poet, reclaim your lute. All fetters are smashed. Servitude's shame shall end. And slavery will finally vanish from our land. Freedom, freedom we salute. So I like that one because the whole poem is a call to arms. And you see repeated over again, arise, come. This is the time to, fight for our freedom. And I think it does a very good job of that and of, pointing out what is the evil that we need to vanquish. So that I think it's a good opening for a lot of this poetry.
One point that I might raise is that there are these larger questions, the matter of enslavement and how to overcome it, and the poet's role, as you were alluding to earlier, in providing that vision, shedding that light. Another aspect to this poem is that it is part of a personal relationship between two men. It is dedicated to Joseph Mention, the son of a well-known New Orleans cigar manufacturer, Lucien Mention, who also has a couple of poems in the volume. And Joseph Mention wrote under the pen name Yacoub in La Tribune. He went on to become a state legislator, so participating very actively in public life. And his coming out, as I might want to say politically, was through poetry at this point. And so Adolphe Duhart, who was his elder poet, is welcoming him. So this is a poem where he's read one of Yacoub or Joseph Mention's poems. and is enchanted, right? There's this new voice in our chorus, join us, and and says you can make these, help contribute to these transformations. So the hidden in plain sight. Certainly, you don't have to know about these relationships to appreciate the poem, but they were a force involved in creating them, right? Part of this network.
So why don't you pick one next, Clint? I'd be curious what you'd like to focus on.
So I'm gonna move on. Perhaps we have a couple picked out by Duart, and Adolphe Duart is actually the prime mover and shaker of the poetry. He's written almost maybe slightly more, almost half of the poems in the volume. But I want to read a version. I say a version of the very first text that that was published and was republished in 1865, May of 1865. Called Ignorance, L'Ignorance by Henri-Louis Rey, who among many of his accomplishments was a spiritualist medium, very well known, who received messages communicated from the dead that also had its own prophetic echoes. This poem appeared in the very first issue of L'Union in 1862, and it was republished in 1865, and the stanzas skip along, and I'm going to read two of them in French, and I will let you read the English translation. So I'm going to bring up my share, and I'll need to skip down to it. There we go. So he's discussing ignorance. That's what the c'est or it is or tis. C'est l'été noir de la science, la cause de tous nos revers. C'est l'enfer vrai de l'existence, le seul Satan de l'univers. Mais ce siècle de lumière, à sa barre, veut juger tout, et notre raison, libre et fière, pénètre maintenant partout.
'Tis the hand that snuffs out science. 'Tis the cause of each and every loss. The true hell of human existence, the sole Satan in the cosmos. But judgment will come clear and loud, for this enlightened age of ours, for reason, rising free and proud, increasingly extends its powers.
One of the things that readers who know French might remark is that the first of these two stanzas is quite literal in my translation. I don't deviate too much from the word by word meaning. The second one takes a tad more liberty to get across the global meaning. I spent many evenings working through these types of issues. So, I'm looking back. When I reread my translations, I think, did I do that right? Should I have shifted something around? But one of the things that that struck me in the second stanza was this notion of siècle de lumière. That is a clear reference to the European Enlightenment, but not only, there were other Enlightenment movements in Latin America as well. So Enlightenment thoughts, I would say transatlantic Enlightenment thought, and even Caribbean Enlightenment thought. So I'll take back my European solely, and I'll say transatlantic Enlightenment thought. And as I was working through it, it wasn't quite clear how to place that. This century of light didn't quite work. And in French, we say les lumières for enlightenment. And it was a clear reference to that. But if I said a century of light, it was lost. So then I came up with this enlightened age of ours will be judging. And in that thread, that intellectual tradition is very clear in the next line, our reason, right? So the ignorance that's being discussed here, there is talk of science, Galileo's mentioned, others, but really in this context, it's prejudice, unfounded prejudice against other human beings, the things that limit us in collective progress. So I had to take a little liberty with the original French to get that across and to convey how Henri-Louis Rey is speaking from this tradition, this transatlantic tradition of Enlightenment reason. Angel, what's stuck out at you? Maybe some of those points, but maybe some others that I haven't realized.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I guess I brought to this whole topic of ignorance, some of the work that I do on race, and where I incorporate some philosophers of race who in fact have a specialty called epistemologies of ignorance. So this question of how is ignorance produced? Where does it come from? And particularly racial ignorance, where does it come from and how is it produced and how does it sustain itself? You know, so I won't go into all of that, but it's a very rich literature. And so as I was reading this poem, it just got me to thinking about ignorance, racial ignorance, and there are different kinds. Is it willful ignorance? I just refuse to know. The thing could be right in front of me and it's as if I just don't see it. Or is it a different kind of ignorance where I just really haven't been exposed to it? I just don't, if I did know, or if I were exposed to it, to an understanding, to a more objective reality about other people, then I would embrace them more fully. So it kind of brought up all of these, sad to say, non-literary aspects of thinking about the nature of ignorance with respect to race, and thinking about many Black intellectuals, especially in the 19th century, thinking, if white people could just have a better understanding, of who we are. But then sadly going into the 20th century and seeing it's actually not that simple. It's not just about getting rid of ignorance. There's so much more there, because sometimes that ignorance is a willful ignorance that people are not willing to give up.
And I would add that the Tribune poets, the poets of l'Union and La Tribune, and the editorial writers were very aware of this willful ignorance because power was involved, right? And maintaining this relationship of subjugation and exploitation. So they were aware that there were people, there was an element of education and creation of empathy, and then there was a willful ignorance. And anyone who delves into the papers will see their great frustration with that factor and attempts to overcome it. So I think we probably have time to discuss one more of our selection, and I would like for you as an enlightened reader, harking to Henri Louis Rey, I would really like to know which excerpt you would like to take a look at.
Okay, so I am going to end on what could be seen a little bit of a downer, but I hope it's not, which is Au cimetière, or at the cemetery, right? And I just bring this one up because it is just so beautiful. It's so beautiful, so
Es tan
mystical,
bello, tan místico y tan...
filled with, kind of yearning and longing. And for those who haven't gotten the book yet, I hope this will be further inducement to get it. But it's organized around kind of the idea of a requiem mass. And so each stanza is interspersed with Latin, often taken directly from the mass. And it is like being ushered through a prayer. So this is the one that I like.
It was also published on November 2nd, I believe 1866, which is All Souls Day, following La Toussaint as well, part of that season. So my Latin was not ecclesiastical Latin that I learned, it was classical Latin. So those of you who have church Latin can forgive me as I read the Latin and the French. Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem, prions. Tout tend à la tombe, gloire, honneur, ivresse, amour, tout fatalement y tombe et disparaît en un jour. Du maître 3 fois auguste, c'est la loi suprême et juste. Jeunesse, vœu superflu, vers qui notre cœur s'élance, doit laisser dans le silence un peu de cendre de plus.
Here, Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem. Let's pray. The tomb takes all, glory and fame, love and delight. Therein all things will fall and vanish as into the night. 'Tis the law supreme and just of our master thrice august. O youth, your wasted wishes, whereto our heart is bent, we offer, ever silent, another heap of ashes.
One thing that I might mention about Adolphe Duhart is that he is a masterful literary creator. He also published 2 short stories in La Tribune. We know that he wrote a play whose text has been lost. Some of those themes are addressed in his other works. And he, by this time, had experienced tremendous personal loss. a couple of years before 3 of his young daughters passed away. There's a heart-wrenching and rending poem about that tragedy that struck his family. So I believe, what I think some of what you felt as a reader, and I certainly felt as a translator, was his true understanding of what it means to lose others and to lose loved ones, which so many people at this time were experiencing as well. Some of your thoughts, Angel? I don't think it's a downer at all. It's sombering, but it's certainly not a downer because it's so beautiful, right? That's the sublime.
Yeah, and you know, I don't think I can really add very much to that. The poem itself is a prayer, you know, and it just ushers you into a really beautiful place.
Also, that gives us an idea of some of the different tones that come out in these 79 poems. I think on that we can move into questions and answers. I'd like to welcome our host, Margaret Longbrake, my editor, my faithful and fearless editor, back onto the screen.
Thank both of you so much. I have to say that as much time as I've spent with these poems and with this book, I learn more every single time that I hear the two of you talk, and it's really just exciting. And there are terrific questions that have been asked over here. I'll remind everyone that anything that we can't get to, please do come on Sunday to the slightly less formal Meet the Author session, because these are all terrific, and I would love to hear much more about all of them. I will start with this one. Did enslaved people have wide access to the newspapers that published these poems? Do we assume that an enslaved person who could read would recite these poems to the others? I would imagine the words and ideas in these poems were so comforting in the sense that it would create a sense of strong shared feelings and emotions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can answer based on some conjecture, but based on my understanding of the context of the newspapers. Before I say that, I will put in a little plug. There's a fairly thorough introduction to the papers, sort of a book inside the book. It takes up about 40, 50, I don't know how many pages, where I do try to give some of the context and the relationship between the Black press, this Creole press, and a potentially enslaved readership is not clear. It would one factor is, where are they living? Are they living in New Orleans, or are they living during the time of enslavement? So during those first years, are they living up the river elsewhere in Louisiana, where the paper may have been distributed in certain offices, and we have records of that, but enslaved people would have been living on farms and plantations? Or are they enslaved people in the urban environment of New Orleans who can kind of slip down to somewhere and get it and pass them around easily? So I think that's one potential answer. Where were they? Another point is that some of the texts do address enslaved people, not only the poems, but others. I've viewed that more as a rhetorical device than an actual literal. I mean, I think it is a literal address, right? It's there, but without presuming. I don't believe that the writers presumed that large numbers of enslaved people would be able to read. That would have certainly been their hope, and we do have plenty of evidence that the staff of L'Union et la Tribune wanted that.
Okay, that's very useful, and it actually leads to, there are several questions about about the newspapers and the practice of publishing poetry in newspapers. When did this practice fade? Did it continue through the 20th century? How much do we know about it? And I'll sort of append to that. There's another question about where one can go to read more about La Tribune de la Nouvelle-Orléans, and these, I'll broaden that to other similar Black American newspapers of the era.
Angel, do you have any first thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to add that your introduction is actually 70 pages. So
thank you.
It's a very robust introduction. So I'm afraid I cannot shed any light on when the poetry stopped. There were many French language
hubieron muchos idiomas.
Century. But you start to see a pretty precipitous decline going into the 20th century. And so Yeah, I can't answer more on that. There was one thing that I was going to append to Clint's answer last time, and is that because this is happening in the 1860s, you also have a very large English-speaking population of enslaved people who wouldn't have had access to the French versions. And even though one of the papers did have an English section, I know from looking through it that not everything was translated directly from the French to the English. It's two completely reading experiences between the French and the English sections.
And to that, I could add that the English side of the Tribune has English language poems, not nearly as many, but there are original contributions by activists and writers in New Orleans. There are a couple of Spanish language poems as well. I had toyed with including them in an appendix, but they didn't quite, it didn't quite match up. And so the question could involve, just to wrap that up, poetry in general in American newspapers. I do look at some newspapers in my historical research throughout the 20th century. I would probably say maybe the 1910s or 1920s when you kind of start to see that go down. Looking at New Orleans papers in the 1890s, there's poetry there. Not quite as much as earlier, but there are certainly verse contributions. As far as where to read more about the papers, there are some good resources on the web. I believe that the Historic New Orleans will be sharing some resources. And as Angel mentioned, not trying to plug the book too much, but we're here for that. I mean, I did a lot of work pulling together as much knowledge as I could to put together a robust, thorough introduction, not only to the poetry, but to the newspapers and the historical and social context as well.
So I would also be really remiss here if I didn't mention Mark Rudini.
Of course.
So the descendant of Louis Charles Rudini, who was very much involved with getting these papers off the ground. So he has some publications as well.
A great website, actually. There's a great sort of briefer history, but also I would say careful history of the Tribune on the website.
Yes, and just a fascinating story about kind of the lost thread of who these ancestors were and how he came to learn about them. And he's just been a really powerful advocate for bringing that history back to light. And so his work and his website would be a wonderful resource.
That's very helpful. I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions that are talking about sort of your more personal interaction with the poetry. There's a question, Clint, about your first engagement with the poetry, the first poem that you read, if you remember it, and how that made you feel. And then I will append to that for you both another question that says, do you find it uplifting to discover and study the depth and power of this tradition of fighting for racial equality, or does it make you think about how little we have progressed in that effort in 160 years?
Ooh, that last one, I've certainly been thinking about it a lot over the past few years, and I imagine that Angel has as well. Before I answer the question that was specifically addressed to me, I just want to mention that Rudini with an EZ, ROUDANEZ.com is Mark Rudini's website. And there's some great resources there. If someone's wanting to hey, as soon as this talk's over, I want to check that out, please do. It's a wonderful resource. So when did I first, I'll talk about this a little more tomorrow if people want to, but I've been interested in French language literature of Louisiana since I was basically a teenager. I mean, I did other teenagery type stuff, but I became interested as a late high school and college student. I've been involved in a French language press at Centenary College of Louisiana, Les Éditions Tintamarre, run by Dr. Dana Kress, my French professor, who's done a lot in getting out Francophone literature of Louisiana in French. There are some editions with notes and introductions, some are republications. So I largely was exposed to it through my studies at Centenary College, and Dr. Kress was already aware of writings by people of color. So I don't remember any specific poem, but I do know that maybe an earlier one was La Marseillaise Noire, the Black Marseillaise, which has been on Centenary Tintamarre's website for, I think I may have been the one to put it on 20 years ago. And that's very striking for a young white man from Shreveport who's trying to figure out the world in which he grew up, to hear this voice coming from Louisiana, taking the French national anthem and turning it into something that speaks to a context that in some ways I felt like I still shared growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, this a need for greater harmony, for recognition of wrongs done to others, and a number of poems I think have bothered me, troubled me, inspired me. And this is getting back to the video that we showed earlier that the Historic New Orleans collection is preparing. You know, a big question that comes up is, who are these poems actually speaking to? I mean, I'm born in 1979, white kid growing up in Louisiana. Now I live up in Canada. Are they really talking to me? You know, in some sense, these poems, the poets did want to speak to the world. So they had a clear idea of universal rights, right? Perhaps more than a lot of us do today in contemporary America and in the march of history, the march of progress. So in some sense, they were addressing me. And in some sense, they were speaking from a very specific place and a very embedded history. I may have gone off on a riff there, but Angel, perhaps there's some elements. I would love to know what you thought. As a scholar, as an African American, as a you know, conscious person, what was the first poem that you found from this world? Maybe it was from another collection like Les Senelles. I don't know.
It was Les Senelles for me. Those were the first poems, and actually I have Edition Tantamar from Centenary College is my edition, and I was very, very glad to find it. Somehow I had missed that you went to Centenary, so that's amazing, and no wonder you're doing the amazing work that you're doing now. So yes, it was the poetry of Les Senelles that was really my first introduction, and then that poetry is just so different from this. You know, it's much more reticent. You have to really kind of read between the lines there more to kind of see. There's kind of this very restrained sense of longing and disappointment in where the country is in terms of race, you know, certainly a sense of betrayal. And so this gets to the question, the other question then, right, of, you know, so how does one feel then, you know, all more than a century and a half later, reading that, especially in light of many of the protests and the brutality of last year. And I would say for me, it is not discouraging. So I don't feel as if we haven't made any progress. I do feel that we have made progress, absolutely. So, you know, my life is not what it would have been in 1865. In fact, this is an interesting day for me to be talking about this, because as I was doing some historical research yesterday for a book that I'm working on, I took a detour away from French Louisiana to look for some of my own ancestors in Mississippi. And, you know, I can't get back to 1865, but I got back pretty far, and, you know, was just overcome with emotion. You know, I'm looking at the census data, looking at the household of my grandfather and his parents, my grandmother and her parents, and thinking, I am looking at what this census taker took down and these precious names when they were sitting there in 1930. They were sitting there, and my grandfather was 1 month old, which is what it said in the record. Could they have imagined now in 2021, you know, their great, however many greats, granddaughter doing this historical research, being a professor, you know, speaking publicly, you know, teaching others? It's just it was an amazing feeling. So I know we've made progress. On the other hand, we cannot forget. And the reason we can't forget is because we come to hard times, right? So I don't always think in terms of a straight line progress. You know, you have different bumps, you kind of have cycles. And when you get into some of those tough times, you need to draw on what the ancestors of the past have done. You know, how did they make sense of their time and their difficulty and their challenge? You know, and if they could come through something so horrific, surely there's a way forward for me.
Angel,
If
Oh,
we
I'm
lose
sorry.
that, I'm sorry, I was going to say, if we lose that, we're truly lost and we go into despair.
I'm
So
going to come in. No, Clint, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the audience will have time for me to discuss a bit more later. And per the last question about do you feel despair or hope, I think that's a wonderful note for us to wrap up on. And I really want to thank you for engaging on these poems today. It's very enriching.
Yes, I was going to say it's absolutely it's only because of time and not because I'm about to cry that that we're wrapping up. But I'm going to actually just a few quick questions, just administratively that were asked. I was asked if Kelly Harris DeBerry and Ivan's video was available. What everyone just saw here was kind of a sneak preview. It and videos with poetry by Mona Lisa Saloy and Kalamu Yasalam will be available on the THNOC website, probably in mid-March. Please check the website. The page with the book is where the information will be, and we'll be able to link you to that. Someone else asked if there are two versions of the book, and I'll just take a chance to hold it up and say, actually, no, there are one version because there is French and English side by side on every single page. So you can learn your French that way. You can read either one. And there were other questions about Les Sennel and about newspapers. So I really hope that everybody comes back on Sunday to talk with Clint more, because there was just a great number of questions that we couldn't get to. Thank you again so much, everybody. It was really wonderful. Thank you so much, Angel, Clint. And we'll just remind everybody again, there'll be one very, very quick survey question that we hope you'll take the time to answer when this is over. Come back at 4 p.m. tomorrow to talk more with Clint, to hear more. And please come at 1 p.m. Today's next session will be with with Brian Keith Mitchell and Nick Weldon, the book Monumental, and Oscar Dunn and his Radical Vision for Louisiana, which will be a terrific session. And we'll have another take on hidden conversations and hidden histories that hopefully the symposium is helping to revive. So thank you again, both of you, and thank you again, attendees, and we'll see you at 1.